Rockville welcomed early spring with puddles on the sidewalks and rare rays of sunshine breaking through the gray clouds. Elliot Frost drove his pickup truck slowly down Maple Street, nodding mechanically to the beat of an old Bob Seger song playing on the speakers. Friday evening was the time when he could finally relax after a busy week at work. Elliot was a civil engineer at a local company that built standard houses for the middle class. He wasn't an outstanding specialist with ambitions to build skyscrapers or stadiums, but he was respected for his attention to detail and reliability. His colleagues often joked that Elliot checked the foundation as if the fate of the world depended on it. Turning onto the driveway of his two-story house with a white fence, Elliot noticed that Veronica's minivan was already parked in the garage. That meant his wife had returned early from the beauty salon where she worked as a senior stylist. He parked at the curb and allowed himself a moment of silence before turning off the engine. 20 years of marriage. Sometimes that number seemed incredible, and sometimes it seemed perfectly natural, as if he and Veronica had always been together. As he entered the house, Elliot heard laughter coming from the kitchen. Veronica was talking animatedly, gesturing with her hands while their daughter Olivia, a 16-year-old carbon copy of her mother with the same chestnut hair and expressive brown eyes, listened attentively, her chin resting on her hand. "Hi," Elliot smiled, putting his briefcase in the corner. "What's so funny that I missed?" "Oh, nothing much." Veronica came over and kissed him lightly on the cheek. "Just discussing Melissa Parker's wedding. Do you remember Melissa? The daughter of Jean from accounting? She's getting married next month, and I'm doing the hair for all the bridesmaids." "Yeah," Elliot nodded, although he had no idea who Melissa was. "Where are the boys?" "Brandon's upstairs," Olivia replied, still on the phone. "He's pretending to do his homework, but he's actually playing video games." "What about Nathan?" asked Elliot, opening the refrigerator to look for a beer. "He's at the Ryans," replied Veronica, returning to cutting vegetables. "He's spending the night there. They're working on some science project for school." Elliot frowned. He didn't remember giving permission for him to stay overnight, but decided not to bring it up now. Brandon was their middle child, a serious 14-year-old teenager who loved nothing more than immersing himself in the world of video games. Nathan, their youngest, was an energetic and outgoing 10-year-old boy who was always surrounded by friends. Elliot felt a special attachment to Nathan, perhaps because he was the only one of his children who had inherited his blonde hair and gray-blue eyes. "By the way, Mom and Dad are coming over for lunch tomorrow," Veronica said casually, stirring something in a pot. "They want to discuss our anniversary." Elliot suppressed a sigh. Margaret and Howard Reeves, Veronica's parents, always gave him mixed feelings. Margaret was a domineering woman who considered it her duty to interfere in all family matters. Howard usually agreed with his wife without saying a word, only occasionally expressing his own opinion. "Can't we decide for ourselves how to celebrate our anniversary?" Elliot asked, trying to sound casual. Veronica glanced at him briefly. "They just want to help. Mom thinks 20 years is a special milestone. She suggested a big party at the country club." "Since when are we members of the country club?" Elliot took a sip of his beer. "Not us, Dad," Veronica clarified. "He joined last year. Remember I told you?" Elliot didn't remember. It seemed like he had been missing a lot of details from his family's life lately. Work was taking up more and more of his time, especially since he had been promoted to senior project engineer for the construction of a new neighborhood on the outskirts of Rockville. "How about we just have dinner at a nice restaurant? Just you, me, and the kids," he suggested. Olivia snorted, her eyes glued to her phone. "Sorry, but I'm not going to spend my evening at a family dinner. I have a date with Josh." "Is that your new boyfriend?" Elliot asked, trying to keep up with his daughter's rapidly changing love life. "Dad," Olivia rolled her eyes, "we've been dating for 2 months." "2 months?" Elliot asked in surprise. "What happened to that tall guy? What was his name? Michael?" Olivia looked at her father with a slightly annoyed expression. "We broke up at Christmas. I told you 100 times." "Oh, right," Elliot nodded, although he didn't actually remember the conversation. Veronica glanced at him with a look of slight disappointment. Elliot knew that look. It had been appearing more and more often in recent years. It was a look that said, "You're too far away from us, even when you're right here." "I'll call Brandon for dinner," Elliot said as he headed upstairs. His son's door was closed. Elliot knocked, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open and saw Brandon wearing headphones, staring intently at his computer screen. The boy was so engrossed in the game that he didn't notice his father's arrival. "Brandon," Elliot put his hand on his son's shoulder. The teenager flinched and turned around, taking off his headphones. "Dad, you scared me." "Sorry, dinner's almost ready. Come on down." Brandon nodded but didn't rush to turn off the computer. "5 more minutes, okay? I'm almost through the level." "What about your homework?" Elliot asked, even though he already knew the answer. "I did it," Brandon replied quickly, avoiding his father's gaze. Elliot sighed but decided not to start an argument. Lately, his conversations with his son had increasingly turned into short exchanges that didn't mean much. He remembered how he and Brandon used to spend hours building model airplanes and discussing the history of aviation. Now, those activities seemed like a distant past. Elliot's gaze fell on a photograph on the wall, a family portrait taken last summer. Veronica was hugging Olivia, and Elliot was standing with Brandon and Nathan on either side. Everyone was smiling, but something about the photograph seemed unnatural to Elliot. Perhaps it was the forced smiles they had put on at the photographer's command. Or maybe it was the fact that Elliot already felt that his family was gradually drifting away from him, even though everything looked perfect on the surface. Dinner was relatively quiet. Olivia kept checking her phone. Brandon was absent-mindedly picking at his plate, and Veronica was recounting the latest gossip, to which Elliot merely nodded mechanically. "So, what about the anniversary?" Veronica asked when the children had left the table. "What do you think of Mom's suggestion?" Elliot took a sip of wine. "I don't know, Veronica. It's our anniversary. I thought we could celebrate it our own way." "How?" She tilted her head to one side. "Dinner at the Olive Garden, as usual." There was a hint of sarcasm in her voice that stung Elliot a little. "What's wrong with the Olive Garden? We've always liked it there." 20 years, Elliot," Veronica emphasized the number. "It's a special date. Maybe we should celebrate it in a special way." Elliot understood her point of view. 20 years was a long time. They had grown up together, raised 3 children, built this house, and created the life they had dreamed of in their youth. But for some reason, the thought of a lavish party at a country club with people who were mostly Veronica's parents' friends didn't fill him with enthusiasm. "Okay," he finally said. "If you want a big party, let's have a big party." Veronica beamed and reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Thank you, dear. Mom will be happy to help with the arrangements." "I'm sure she will," Elliot muttered, but Veronica didn't seem to notice the irony in his voice. On Sunday, the Frost home was filled with the smell of roast meat and the sound of lively conversation. Margaret Reeves, a short, energetic woman dressed with impeccable taste, commanded the kitchen like a general on a battlefield. "Veronica, you have to stir the sauce constantly or it will curdle," she instructed her daughter. "Olivia, dear, set the table with nice napkins, not the paper ones you usually use." Howard, a tall man with thinning gray hair, sat silently in the living room with Elliot, occasionally glancing sympathetically at his son-in-law. "How's work?" Howard asked, breaking the awkward silence. "Fine," Elliot replied. "We're starting a new project on the east side of town, a residential complex with 20 houses." "Sounds good," Howard nodded. A good job is important. Stability. Elliot knew that Howard had always valued stability above all else. He had worked for the same insurance company for 40 years, starting as a sales agent and ending up as a regional manager. For him, work was not a calling but a means of providing for his family. Nathan burst into the room, holding a model airplane in his hands. "Grandpa, look what I made at school." Howard smiled and his face lit up. He was a different man when his grandchildren were around, more lively and energetic. "Great job, kid." He took the model in his hands. "That's a Messerschmitt, right?" "Yes." Nathan nodded enthusiastically. "Dad said it was one of the best fighter planes of World War II. "Your dad's right," Howard winked at Elliot, "although the Spitfire was just as good." "But the Messerschmitt was faster," Nathan objected. "Dad, tell Grandpa." Elliot smiled at his son. Actually, the Spitfire was a very maneuverable plane, maybe not as fast, but in aerial combat. "Lunch is ready." Margaret interrupted their conversation, entering the living room. "Nathan, dear, put the plane away and wash your hands." Nathan grimaced but obeyed his grandmother. Elliot caught Veronica's eye as she stood in the kitchen doorway, and she shrugged her shoulders slightly, as if apologizing for her mother. Over dinner, the conversation inevitably turned to the upcoming anniversary celebration. Margaret laid out glossy brochures for a country club in front of them. "Here, look. A banquet hall with a view of the lake, live music, excellent cuisine. I've already spoken to the manager, and he can reserve the hall for May 28th. "It looks expensive," Elliot remarked cautiously. "Oh, don't worry about that," Margaret waved her hand. "It's our gift to you. 20 years of marriage is rare these days." "Really?" Elliot raised an eyebrow. "I thought divorce wasn't that common in our generation." "You'd be surprised," Margaret replied. "Last year alone, 4 couples we were friends with got divorced in our town. It's terrible. I feel especially sorry for the children." Brandon, who had been silently eating his piece of meat until then, suddenly perked up. "Is it true that if you and Mom got divorced, I could live with whoever I wanted?" "Brandon!" Veronica exclaimed. "What nonsense is that?" "I just asked," the boy shrugged. "Is that allowed?" "Theoretically, at your age, the court could take your opinion into account," Elliot remarked. "But that doesn't mean you can just choose, and your mom and I are not getting divorced." "Of course not," Veronica quickly added, giving her son a stern look. "And stop asking questions like that at the table." The atmosphere at the table became tense. Olivia cleared her throat and changed the subject. "Grandma, tell us about the cruise you and Grandpa are planning." Margaret eagerly switched to her favorite topic, the trips she and Howard had taken since he retired. Elliot noticed Veronica glance gratefully at her daughter. After dinner, while Margaret and Veronica cleared the table and Howard dozed in his chair, Elliot went out to the backyard where Nathan was playing with a soccer ball. "Pass!" Nathan shouted, and Elliot caught the ball. "Dad, can you do a scissor kick?" "I used to be able to," Elliot smiled. "But that was a long time ago, when I was a little older than you." "Show me." Nathan looked at his father with admiration. "I'm afraid I'll strain my back if I try," Elliot said, ruffling his son's hair. "Uncle Garrison was much better at soccer than I was." "Uncle Garrison is cool," Nathan agreed. "He promised to teach me how to snowboard next season." "Really?" Elliot asked, feeling a slight pang of irritation. His brother Garrison, who worked as a snowboard instructor at a nearby ski resort, often made such promises without checking with their parents first. "Well, let's see how things go at school. If your grades are good, maybe we'll let you." "I went with Uncle Garrison a lot last season when you were busy at work," Nathan said, kicking the ball. "Mom said I could." Elliot frowned. He didn't remember Veronica mentioning those trips, but maybe that was just another detail of family life he had missed. "He came over when you weren't home," Nathan continued, "and we played video games. He's better than you at Fortnite. Sure, Elliot said dryly. I just learned how to play that game. Nathan laughed, then suddenly said seriously, You know, Mom said once that I'm most like you. She said Olivia and Brandon have different personalities. Really? Elliot crouched down next to his son. What else did she say? She said it's because, Nathan faltered as if trying to remember the exact words. Well, she said it's because I have a different father, not like theirs. Elliot felt the ground slip away beneath his feet. He tried to keep his expression calm. What do you mean, Nathan? What do you mean? Different father. I don't know, the boy shrugged. I didn't understand either. She was talking on the phone with Aunt Audrey and said it. Then she noticed I was listening and quickly changed the subject. It was weird. Yeah, weird, Elliot agreed, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. Hey, want to play ball some more? Nathan nodded happily, already forgetting what he had said. But for Elliot, the world seemed to freeze for a moment. Another father. What did Veronica mean? Maybe Nathan had misunderstood or gotten something mixed up. Elliot was distracted for the rest of the day, his thoughts constantly returning to his son's words. When Veronica's parents finally left, promising to return soon with a detailed plan for the party, Elliot felt relieved. He needed silence to process what he had heard. That evening, after the children had gone to bed and Veronica was taking a shower, Elliot sat in his study looking at the family photos on the wall. The resemblance between him and Nathan was obvious. But now, as he looked closely at the photos of Olivia and Brandon, he noticed that they didn't really look much like him. Dark hair, brown eyes. They looked more like Veronica or Harrison. The thought was so absurd that Elliot tried to push it away, but Nathan's words kept echoing in his head. A different father, not like theirs. Veronica entered the study, wrapped in a bathrobe, her hair still damp. "What are you doing?" she asked, coming up behind him and putting her hands on his shoulders. "Just thinking," Elliot replied, closing his laptop. "So much to do at work." "Don't think about work," she said, leaning down and kissing his neck. "Let's think about our anniversary. 20 years, can you believe it?" "Yes," Elliot nodded. 20 years, almost half our lives. Veronica sat down next to him, still holding his hand. "Remember how we met at that stupid school dance?" "Of course," Elliot smiled. "You were wearing a blue dress and refused to dance with me until I brought you some punch." "And then you spilled it on my dress," Veronica laughed. "And I had to walk around with a huge red stain all night." "It was my genius plan," Elliot winked at her. "No one else would have asked you to dance after that." They laughed, reminiscing about their youth. For a moment, Elliot felt that all his suspicions were ridiculous. They had been together for so many years, raised 3 children, but Nathan's words kept echoing in his head. "Veronica," he began cautiously, "Nathan said something strange to me today." "Hmm?" Veronica leaned against his shoulder. "He said he heard you say that he has a different father, not the same one as Olivia and Brandon." Veronica tensed instantly but then laughed, although Elliot thought her laughter sounded a little forced. "Oh God, that's ridiculous. He must have misunderstood. I was talking to Audrey about how Nathan is more like you than the other kids. You know how kids pick up on adult conversations." Elliot looked at his wife intently. Her explanation sounded reasonable enough, but something in her eyes, a shadow that flashed for a moment, made him doubt her. "You're probably right," he said finally. "It was just strange." "Kids," Veronica shrugged. "They say things like that sometimes." She stood up and held out her hand to him. "Shall we go to bed? Tomorrow will be a difficult day." Elliot took her hand and followed her, but the feeling of unease remained. Already in bed, long after Veronica had fallen asleep, he lay with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling. Something was wrong. Something in their perfect family life was cracking and crumbling like old plaster. and Elliot wasn't sure he wanted to know what was hidden beneath the facade. Monday morning greeted Elliot with a gloomy outlook. It was drizzling outside and his mood was even gloomier. He lay in bed, listening to Veronica getting ready for work, habitually banging the drawers of her dresser and humming a tune under her breath. Elliot glanced at the clock. 6:30 a.m. He had half an hour before he had to get up, but sleep was no longer coming. Yesterday's conversation with Nathan was still on his mind. I have a different father, not like theirs. Elliot understood that children often make mistakes, misinterpret what they hear, but something in Veronica's reaction yesterday, that fleeting shadow in her eyes, her overly quick explanation, had planted a seed of doubt in him that was now growing like mold on a damp wall. Elliot, are you awake? Veronica peeked into the bedroom, already fully dressed and wearing makeup. I made coffee, and don't forget to pick up Olivia after rehearsal today. I have a client this evening. Okay, he nodded, climbing out from under the covers. What time? 5. And buy milk on your way home. We're out. A typical morning, typical requests, everything as usual. But for some reason, today Elliot looked at his wife differently, more attentively, more intently. He searched her face for features of their children, trying to mentally compare who looked more like whom. The office greeted him with its usual hustle and bustle. James Rand, the project director, immediately dragged Elliot into a meeting about a new residential complex. 3 hours of discussing technical details, which usually completely absorbed Elliot's attention, passed him by today. He nodded, took notes, even said something, but his thoughts were far away. Hey, Frost, are you with us? James patted him on the shoulder when the meeting ended. I've asked you twice about the foundation specifications. Sorry, I was lost in thought, Elliot rubbed his temple. The final drawings will be ready by Wednesday. Are you okay? James frowned. You seem distracted today. I just didn't get enough sleep, Elliot dismissed. Nothing serious. During his lunch break, alone in his office, Elliot opened his browser and, after hesitating, typed home DNA test into the search bar. He was surprised at himself. Just yesterday, the thought that one of his children might not be his biological child would have seemed ridiculous to him. But today, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The search engine returned several options. Elliot chose a company with good reviews and read the description of the procedure. A saliva sample, sent to the lab, results in 2 to 3 weeks. Anonymity guaranteed. He closed the tab without placing an order. It was crazy to test his own children without their knowledge. But in the evening, after putting the children to bed and finding himself alone in his study, he opened the website again. His doubts wouldn't leave him. It was like a splinter. The longer he left it, the more it hurt. He could just talk to Veronica, ask her directly. But what if she lied? What if the truth was too painful? Before going to bed, Elliot placed an order for 3 DNA test kits. Delivery within 1 to 2 days, payment by card. He felt like he was doing something forbidden, like crossing an invisible line. But there was no turning back now. On Wednesday, when he got home earlier than usual, Elliot found a small box on the porch. It was exactly what he had ordered. He quickly hid it in his briefcase and only took it out late at night when everyone was asleep to look at it. 3 plastic containers for samples, instructions, and a prepaid envelope for shipping. Everything was simple and anonymous. Elliot sat for a long time staring at the kit. How would he get the samples? And did he really need to do this? Maybe it was just paranoia, inspired by a strange phrase uttered by a 10-year-old child. He remembered how, many years ago when Nathan was born, the nurse at the maternity ward had said, "This one is definitely yours. He's the spitting image of his father." At the time, Elliot had just smiled, proud of being a father, but now he wondered why she had said that. Did she mean something specific, or was it just a standard phrase they said to all fathers? The next few days turned into a real detective operation for Elliot. He thought through every step, waiting for the right moment. When Brandon left a half-empty glass of juice on the table, Elliot carefully picked it up and poured some into a container. When Olivia threw away her used toothbrush, he discreetly retrieved it from the trash. Nathan was easier. Elliot simply asked him to help seal an envelope, and the boy readily licked the adhesive strip. All the while, Elliot felt like a traitor. He avoided Veronica's gaze, afraid that her feminine intuition would reveal what he was up to. But on the other hand, if his suspicions were unfounded, no one would ever know about the test, and life would go on as before. On Friday, Elliot sent the envelope with the samples to the lab. Now all he had to do was wait. Time dragged on agonizingly slowly. During the day, Elliot immersed himself in his work, trying not to think about the test, but at night he was overcome with doubts. He began to notice details he hadn't noticed before. For example, how often Veronica talked on the phone while going out to the backyard, where she couldn't be heard, or how rarely Garrison had been coming to their house lately, even though he used to be a frequent guest. "I'm just getting myself worked up," Elliot thought, trying to calm down. But then he remembered Nathan's words, and the cycle began again. During the 2 weeks he waited for the results, Elliot hardly spoke to his wife, only about household matters and the children. Veronica attributed his aloofness to his busy work schedule, or maybe she just didn't want to ask. In their marriage, it had long been customary not to pry too deeply into each other's lives. One evening, when Veronica took Olivia to try on dresses for the prom, Elliot decided to sort through some old papers in their bedroom. He had been meaning to do it for a long time. The box of documents in the back of the closet was taking up too much space. Among the insurance policies, receipts, and old photographs, Elliot came across Veronica's medical card from the women's clinic. He wasn't going to read it. His wife's personal documents were none of his business. But as he was rearranging the papers, Elliot accidentally dropped the card, and a folded piece of paper fell out. It was the results of some kind of test. Elliot picked it up and was about to put it back when the date in the upper corner caught his eye. June 16th, exactly 9 months before Brandon was born. Elliot's eyes involuntarily scanned the lines. Diagnosis: severe pathospermia. Chances of natural conception are extremely low. Recommended: donor insemination or IVF. Elliot reread the note several times, unable to believe his eyes. It was his diagnosis. His name was at the top of the form. But how was that possible? They had 3 children: Olivia, Brandon, and Nathan. Elliot tried to remember that period of his life. Yes, in the early years of their marriage they had had problems conceiving. They had been tested, but Veronica said everything was fine. And then, almost 3 years later, she became pregnant with Olivia. Elliot sat down on the bed, clutching the ill-fated piece of paper in his hand. Something didn't add up. If he had serious sperm problems, how could they have conceived 3 children naturally? Or not naturally? Or not them? He started rummaging through the papers again, now purposefully looking for something that could explain this oddity. But he found nothing else of significance. Only old photographs, among which was one that Elliot didn't remember. Veronica, very young, with a belly in the last months of pregnancy, and next to her was his brother Garrison, hugging her shoulders. There was nothing unusual about it. He had always been close to Garrison, but something in their expressions, in the way Garrison looked at Veronica, made Elliot wary. He carefully put all the papers back in the box, keeping only a copy of the medical report for himself. He needed to think about this alone. The next day, during his lunch break, Elliot called his old friend Howard Middleton, who worked as a doctor at a local clinic. "Howard, hi, it's Elliot Frost. Are you busy?" "I always have time for you, old friend," Howard said with genuine joy in his voice. How can I help? I need some advice. Of a personal nature. Elliot looked around to make sure no one was nearby. I found my old diagnosis, severe pathospermia, and I have a question. Is it possible to conceive a child naturally with this diagnosis? There was a short pause on the other end of the line. Well, Elliot, medicine isn't always an exact science, Howard finally said cautiously. In rare cases, it's possible. But if the diagnosis has been confirmed by a good laboratory, the probability is extremely low, especially when it comes to a severe form. Is there any way to cure this condition? Or does it improve over time? There are treatments, but they are not always effective in severe cases, and spontaneous improvement is unlikely. Howard paused. Elliot, I don't want to pry into your personal life, but I think you should talk to a good urologist. Or your wife. Thanks, Howard. Elliot ignored the last sentence. I'll think about your advice. This conversation only reinforced his suspicions. If his diagnosis was really that serious, how could they have had 3 children? Had Veronica been lying to him all this time? But why? And how? Elliot decided to dig deeper. That evening, when everyone was asleep, he picked up the box of documents again, this time looking through the papers more carefully. Among them were the medical records of all 3 children. Elliot studied their blood types. Olivia was type B, Brandon was also type B, and Nathan was type A. Elliot himself was type A. Veronica was type B. Okay, Elliot thought, remembering his high school biology lessons. If I'm type A and Veronica is type B, then our children could be either type A or type B. So, the blood types all match. This calmed him down a little. But he remembered the diagnosis and understood that blood type was only part of the genetic puzzle. A few days later, Elliot received an email from the lab. The attached PDF file was password protected, and the password was sent to him in a separate message. Elliot locked himself in his office, canceled all his meetings, and opened the document with trembling hands. The results were crystal clear. Nathan was his biological son. The probability of paternity was 99.9%, but Olivia and Brandon, for them, the probability of paternity was 0%. Elliot felt his breath catch in his throat. His head was ringing with emptiness. He felt as if he were about to pass out from the emotional overload, but instead a strange detachment washed over him. It was as if he were watching himself from the outside, a man whose world had just collapsed. More than an hour passed before Elliot was able to collect his thoughts. His first instinct was to call Veronica immediately and demand an explanation, but something stopped him. The engineering methodicalness that had always helped him in his work told him that if he wanted to know the whole truth, he had to gather all the facts before jumping to conclusions. Elliot printed out the test results and put them in his safe. Then he opened a new file on his computer and wrote down the facts he already knew. First, I was diagnosed with severe pathospermia 9 months before Brandon was born. Second, Olivia and Brandon are not my biological children. Third, Nathan is my biological son. Fourth, Veronica has kept this a secret all these years. He stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing what to do next. How could he explain these facts? Who was Olivia and Brandon's biological father? And why had Veronica never told him the truth? Memories flooded back to him. How Garrison had spent a lot of time with Veronica when they were having trouble conceiving. How, after Olivia was born, Veronica's mother kept saying that the girl looked so much like her father, not you, Elliot, but your father when he was a child. And everyone laughed because it seemed like a joke. Like pieces of a puzzle, these memories began to form a picture that made Elliot feel physically ill. He opened the file with the DNA test results again. It said that the children who were not Elliot's biological children had a common father. That meant that whoever this man was, he was the father of both Olivia and Brandon, but not Nathan's. Elliot went on social media and started looking through Garrison's profile. His brother rarely posted photos, preferring to share pictures of mountain landscapes and snowboarders. But in his old albums, Elliot found several family photos. In one of them, taken about 10 years ago, Garrison was surrounded by his nephews, playing with Olivia and a very young Brandon, holding him in his arms. Elliot enlarged the photo and looked closely at the faces. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same cheekbones, the same slanted eyes. The children looked more like his brother than him. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Elliot answered calls and emails, checked drawings, met with contractors, all on autopilot while his mind tried to process the information he had received. When he got home that evening, he looked at his family with different eyes. Olivia was engrossed in her phone, Brandon was playing video games, and Nathan was showing his mother a drawing. It was a normal family evening, except now Elliot knew that this wasn't his family, or not entirely his. He called Brandon over to show him something on his phone, just an excuse to get a closer look at his son's face. No, not his son, he reminded himself, but Garrison's son. Now, the resemblance was obvious. The same dark hair, the same shape of the nose, even the way he frowned was just like Garrison. "Dad, what are you looking at?" Brandon asked, clearly uncomfortable under Elliot's intense gaze. "Nothing," Elliot forced a smile. "Just thought you've grown up a lot in the last year." Dinner was spent in tense silence. Elliot hardly participated in the conversation, and Veronica kept casting worried glances at him. "Is everything okay?" she asked when they were alone in the kitchen. "You seem quiet tonight." "Just tired," Elliot lied. "Had a rough day at work." "Maybe you should get some rest before our anniversary?" Veronica approached him and put her hand on his shoulder. "It's only 2 weeks away, and we have so many plans." Elliot felt a wave of anger rising inside him. Their anniversary. 20 years of marriage based on lies. He struggled to keep from saying what he was thinking. But no, it wasn't time yet. He needed to know the whole truth before he could act. "Yes, I need to rest," he said, pulling away from her touch. "I'm going to bed early." In the bedroom, Elliot took the test results out of the safe and reread them. Then he opened his laptop and began new research. He looked for information about pathospermia, treatment options, and the chances of conceiving a child with this diagnosis. All sources confirmed Howard's words. The probability of natural conception with severe pathospermia is close to 0. Then he moved on to the next question: how to improve spermatogenesis. Maybe after Olivia and Brandon were born, his condition improved, and that's why Nathan is his biological son. He found several scientific articles describing treatment methods, but nowhere was there any mention of spontaneous recovery. And then it dawned on him. Veronica had never told him about any treatment. She had never mentioned that he needed to take any medication or undergo any procedures to improve his sperm production. How could Nathan be his biological son? Another thought occurred to Elliot. He opened the file with the test results and looked closely at the children's birth dates. Olivia was born 4 years after the wedding, Brandon 2 years after Olivia, and Nathan 4 years after Brandon. There was a strange gap between the second and third children. What was going on in their lives at that time? Elliot racked his brain. Around that time, he and Veronica had a serious falling out. The only time they ever seriously talked about divorce. The reason was that he found out about her financial shenanigans. Veronica had been secretly taking money from their joint account and transferring it to her mother. They didn't speak for a week, and Elliot even moved in with a friend. Then Veronica came to him with an apology, and they made up. Shortly after that, she became pregnant with Nathan. What if, Elliot thought, what if she was afraid of divorce and decided to tie me to her with a real child? It sounded like the plot of a cheap detective story, but Elliot couldn't think of any other explanation. He realized he needed to meet with Garrison, not to accuse him or cause a scene, but to see his reaction to the news about the DNA test. If Garrison really was Olivia and Brandon's father, his face would give him away. Lying in bed next to Veronica, who was sleeping peacefully, Elliot stared at the ceiling and thought about his next move. His engineering mind worked clearly and methodically. First, a meeting with Harrison, then perhaps a conversation with Veronica's mother. She had always been aware of her daughter's affairs, and only then would he confront his wife. By that time, he should have all the facts at his disposal. For the first time in many years, Elliot felt like a stranger in his own home, like an uninvited guest who was being tolerated out of politeness. But he had spent 20 years building this house, providing for this family, loving these children. Children who, as it turned out, were not his children, or rather, two of them were not. Despite this bitter thought, Elliot knew he couldn't stop loving Olivia and Brandon. They had grown up in his arms. He had changed their diapers, taught them to walk, read to them at night, rejoiced in their first words and first steps. Biology didn't matter. They were his children anyway. But the lies. Those years of lies had poisoned everything. How could Veronica live with that? How could she look him in the eye every morning knowing she had betrayed him in the most terrible way? Elliot rolled onto his side, turning away from his wife. 20 years. 20 years of living a lie. Well, it would soon be over. He would find out the truth no matter how bitter it was, and then he would decide what to do next. I sincerely apologize for the repeated mistakes. I will write only the third chapter with an accurate character count, 7,000, 9,000. Elliot thought long and hard about how best to talk to his brother. He arranged to meet Garrison at the Blue Pine, a small bar on the outskirts of Rockville where they often hung out in their youth. The place was chosen for a reason. The dim lighting and soft music created an atmosphere where their conversation would go unnoticed. As usual, Garrison was 15 minutes late. Elliot had already ordered a beer and was relaxing, watching the few other patrons in the bar. "Sorry, bro," Garrison said, slumping down in the chair opposite him. "The last group of tourists got held up on the slope. I couldn't leave earlier." "No problem," Elliot shrugged. "I ordered you a bourbon." "Great," Garrison smiled, and Elliot couldn't help but notice how much that smile resembled Brandon's. "So, what happened? You sounded kind of mysterious on the phone." Elliot took a sip of beer, thinking about how to start the conversation. He couldn't just lay the DNA test results on the table. He needed a more subtle approach. "I'm planning a surprise for Veronica for our anniversary," he began, watching his brother's reaction closely. 20 years, huh?" 20 years, Garrison whistled. "I can't believe you've been together that long. I would have gone crazy in the third year." "Well, not everyone can be a bachelor forever," Elliot smiled. For a moment, he thought he saw something like guilt flash in Garrison's eyes, but he quickly looked away. "So, how can I help?" Garrison took a sip of bourbon. "You know I'm not very romantic." Elliot leaned forward, giving the impression that he was confiding in his brother. "I want to make a video for her. Something like a history of our family, photos, memories. I need your help with the material." "I'm sure I have some old photos," Garrison nodded. "I'll look for some over the weekend." "That would be great," Elliot paused. "By the way, do you remember when Veronica and I were trying to have children? The first few years of our marriage?" Garrison tensed noticeably, though he tried not to show it. "Vaguely. It was a long time ago." "Yes, a long time ago," Elliot agreed. "I was thinking about it recently and realized that you spent a lot of time with Veronica during that period. Remember, you even took her to her doctor's appointments when I couldn't get out of work?" Garrison's hand, holding the glass, trembled slightly. "Yes, I remember. I always tried to help. We're family." "Family," Elliot echoed. "You know, I recently came across an old medical document. I was diagnosed with serious sperm problems back then, severe pathospermia, That's what it was called. Garrison stared into his glass, avoiding his brother's gaze. Elliot, where are you going with this? Just thinking out loud. Elliot shrugged. It's strange, isn't it? With a diagnosis like that, the chances of conceiving a child naturally are practically zero, and we have 3. There was a long pause. Garrison clearly didn't know what to say. Listen, Ellie, he finally said, using his brother's childhood nickname, medicine isn't always an exact science. There are mistakes, miracles. Miracles, Elliot nodded. Especially when a child is born with dark hair and brown eyes, even though his father has blonde hair and blue eyes. Genetics can be surprising sometimes, huh? Garrison's head snapped up, his face turning pale. Elliot, what are you— I know, Garrison, Elliot said quietly, looking his brother straight in the eye. I took a DNA test. Olivia and Brandon aren't my kids. They're yours. Garrison looked as if he had been punched in the stomach. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again, but couldn't say a word. I'm not going to make a scene, Elliot continued in the same calm tone. I just want to know the truth, the whole truth. Garrison downed his bourbon in one gulp and motioned for the bartender to bring him another. When the new glass appeared in front of him, he took a deep breath and finally spoke. It wasn't my plan, Ellie, I swear. It was all Margaret's idea. Margaret? Veronica's mother? Elliot frowned. What does she have to do with this? Garrison rubbed his face with his hands as if trying to wipe away the tension. When you and Veronica were unable to have children, Margaret was desperate. She wanted grandchildren more than anything in the world, especially a boy who would carry on the family line. She learned about your diagnosis from Veronica, and then Margaret came to me with a proposal. A proposal? Elliot couldn't believe his ears. She said that if I helped, no one would ever know. You and I are alike. We're brothers. We share the same genes. The child would still be part of the Frost family. Garrison spoke quietly, without looking up. I refused at first. It was crazy. But then Veronica came to me herself. She cried, said she was afraid of losing you if she couldn't have the baby. That it was the only way out. And you agreed, Elliot said hollowly. I was young and stupid, Garrison said, looking at him guiltily. And I always liked Veronica, even before you two started dating. But she chose you, and I accepted that. And then, it seemed like such a simple solution. Just once, no one would ever know, and everyone would be happy. Just once, Elliot smiled bitterly. What about Brandon? Garrison lowered his head. After Olivia was born, Margaret wouldn't let it go. She wanted a boy. She pressured Veronica, and Veronica pressured me. I know there's no excuse for what I did, Elliot. I betrayed you, twice. Elliot felt a hurricane of emotions raging inside him. Anger, pain, disappointment. But he forced himself to remain calm. He needed all the information. What about Nathan? He asked. Is he really my son? Yes, Garrison nodded. After Brandon was born, I told Veronica that I wasn't going to be part of this deception anymore. I went to Colorado for 2 years and worked as an instructor in the mountains. When I came back, you already had Nathan. What does Audrey's husband have to do with this? Tim? Elliot remembered that there had to be some connection to Veronica's sister's husband. Garrison raised his eyebrows in surprise. Tim? You know about that too? Elliot realized he had accidentally jumped ahead in his investigation, but decided not to back down. I heard something, but I want to hear the details from you. Garrison shook his head. That was after I refused. Margaret still wanted another boy in the family. She was obsessed with the idea. It seems Tim agreed to help, but something went wrong. I don't know the details. Veronica didn't tell me. All I know is that Audrey almost caught them, and since then, the relationship between the sisters has been tense. Elliot silently pondered what he had heard. Everything matched what he already knew from the DNA test results and his own observations. But one detail still bothered him. If you refused after Brandon and Tim also dropped out for some reason, how could Veronica get pregnant with Nathan from me? With my diagnosis? Garrison thought for a moment. I'm not sure. Maybe the diagnosis was wrong. Or maybe your fertility problems were related to something else. Elliot remembered the doctor who had counseled him and Veronica back then, many years ago. Dr. Stein, an elderly man with thick eyebrows and an accent. He had shown them some charts and explained sperm morphology. It had been so long ago that the details had faded from his memory. But Elliot remembered how he felt, ashamed, embarrassed, inadequate. She never told me about your involvement, Elliot said, returning to reality. Not a word in all these years. She was afraid of losing you, Garrison replied quietly. She loves you, Ellie. She always has. Elliot snorted. Strange love, built on lies and betrayal. I'm not excusing her. Garrison shook his head. Or myself. We were wrong. But you don't choose your children, Ellie. They're yours. You raise them. I know. Elliot rubbed the bridge of his nose. That's the only thing keeping me from wanting to destroy everything around me. The children aren't to blame. They fell silent. The bar grew noisier. It was Friday night and the regulars were starting to arrive. Someone turned on the jukebox and the bar filled with the sounds of old rock and roll. What are you going to do? Garrison finally asked. I haven't decided yet, Elliot replied honestly. First, I want to know the whole truth. I'll talk to Margaret. She won't admit it, Garrison said quickly. She'll never admit her role in all this. We'll see. Elliot finished his beer and stood up. Thanks for your honesty, Gar. At least you've been honest with me. Garrison lowered his head, taking the blow. I know you'll never forgive me, but I want you to know that I sincerely regret what I did. Elliot looked at his younger brother, the man he had protected from bullies as a child, with whom he had shared a room and secrets, whom he had trusted, and he had betrayed him in the most humiliating way possible. And yet, he was his brother, his blood, his only surviving relative after their parents' death. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, Harry, Elliot said quietly. But you're still my brother, and you're the father of my children, whether I like it or not. We'll have to live with that somehow. He turned and walked out of the bar, leaving Garrison sitting alone in front of his nearly empty glass. The next day, Elliot called Margaret and suggested they meet for lunch. He said he wanted to discuss the details of the upcoming anniversary celebration, and Margaret gladly agreed. They arranged to meet at the Garden Pavilion, a pretentious French restaurant she loved for its European atmosphere. Elliot arrived early and chose a table in the corner, away from other diners. Margaret arrived at exactly 1 o'clock, as always impeccably dressed and perfectly coiffed. Elliot, dear, she said, offering her cheek for a kiss. How nice of you to invite me to lunch. I thought we should discuss the celebration, Elliot smiled, pulling out a chair for her. 20 years is a significant milestone after all. Oh, certainly, Margaret beamed. I already have a few ideas. I spoke with the club manager and he suggested. Elliot let her talk, watching her expression. Margaret had always seemed like a powerful and slightly manipulative woman to him, but now he saw her in a new light, as the architect of a long-running deception that had destroyed his family. That sounds wonderful, he said when she paused. But before we get into the details, I'd like to discuss something personal. Margaret frowned slightly. Of course, dear. Is something wrong? Elliot took a sip of water, gathering his thoughts. I recently came across an interesting medical document. Remember many years ago when Veronica and I were trying to have children, I was diagnosed with severe pathospermia. Margaret froze for a moment but quickly regained her composure. Vaguely, she dismissed. That was so long ago. But obviously the diagnosis was wrong because you have 3 beautiful children. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. Elliot leaned closer. What do you think, Margaret? What are the chances of conceiving a child naturally with that diagnosis? I'm not a doctor, dear, Her voice remained even, but her fingers clenching the napkin turned white. But miracles do happen, don't they? Miracles, Elliot repeated slowly. Funny, Garrison used that word too. Margaret raised her head sharply, fear flashing in her eyes. Garrison? What does he have to do with this? I saw him yesterday. We had a very frank conversation. Margaret paled but kept her composure. I don't know what you're talking about, Elliot. If you have something to say, say it. All right. Elliot looked her straight in the eye. I know that Olivia and Brandon are not my biological children. I know their father is Garrison, and I know you arranged all this. You convinced my wife to cheat on me with my brother so you could have the grandchildren you always wanted. Margaret was speechless for a moment. Then her eyes narrowed and she went on the offensive. What nonsense! This must be some kind of misunderstanding. Garrison must have been joking or you misunderstood him. Olivia and Brandon are your children, Elliot. Look at them closely. You'll see your features. I had a DNA test done, Margaret, Elliot replied calmly. The results are clear. Only Nathan is my biological son. Margaret looked as if she had been struck. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, but couldn't say a word. Listen, Elliot softened his tone. I'm not going to make a scene. I just want to know the truth, the whole truth, including what happened to Tim and Audrey. At the mention of her son-in-law's name, Margaret's face contorted. Tim, she snorted contemptuously. That weakling. He agreed to help, then chickened out at the last minute. Said he couldn't betray Audrey, as if it was about betrayal. We just wanted a child for our family. We? Elliot repeated. You mean you and Veronica? Yes. Margaret seemed to see no point in denying the obvious. Veronica wanted another child, a boy. Harrison refused, said he wouldn't be part of it anymore. Tim was the logical choice. He's family. He looks like you, but he turned out to be a coward. And then, by some miracle, Veronica got pregnant by me. Elliot shook his head. Despite my diagnosis. Margaret pursed her lips. Well, maybe the diagnosis was inaccurate, or your condition improved. What difference does it make? Nathan is your son. You confirmed it yourself. The difference is, Margaret, that you and Veronica lied to me for years. You destroyed my family. We created your family. Margaret raised her voice but immediately caught herself and looked around. Fortunately, no one had paid any attention to them. Without our intervention, you wouldn't have Olivia or Brandon. You would have been alone. I could have adopted children, Elliot said quietly, or used donor sperm, or found other medical solutions. But I wasn't given a choice. Instead, I was lied to for 20 years. Margaret looked at him defiantly. What's done is done. Yes, we made a mistake. But don't you love your children, Elliot? Haven't they become a part of you? I love them, Elliot replied without hesitation. And that's why I'm here talking to you instead of making a public scene. But I need to know the whole truth before I can decide what to do next. Margaret looked at him intently, as if gauging his resolve. All right, she said finally. I'll tell you everything, but not here. Let's go to my house. Howard is playing golf with his friends today, so we won't be disturbed. At the Reeves house, Margaret poured herself a brandy, even though it was barely noon. Elliot declined a drink. He needed a clear head. You're right about some things, Elliot, Margaret began, settling into an armchair. I did push Veronica into her decision with Garrison, but not because I'm some kind of villain like you think. It was because I wanted happiness for my daughter, and for you too. For me? Elliot raised an eyebrow. How could deception make me happy? You wanted children very much, Elliot. You both did. Veronica cried herself to sleep every night when another test came back negative. You got tested, and when it turned out the problem was you, she sighed. You were so devastated. Veronica was afraid you'd fall into a depression. Elliot remembered that time. He really did feel inadequate, guilty toward Veronica. But that didn't justify the deception. Audrey and Tim, he reminded her. What happened between them and Veronica? Margaret took a large sip of brandy. After Garrison refused to help with a third child, Veronica was desperate. She and Audrey had always been rivals, and the thought of her sister having more children than her was unbearable for Veronica. I suggested talking to Tim. He always seemed malleable. And he agreed? At first. But then, when it came down to it, he couldn't do it. He said he loved Audrey and couldn't cheat on her. Margaret grimaced as if remembering something unpleasant. Audrey somehow found out about the conversation. Maybe Tim told her himself. The sisters have barely spoken since. And then Nathan came along, Elliot said thoughtfully. My real son. How did that happen, Margaret? How can you explain this medical miracle? Margaret looked away. I don't know all the details. Veronica only told me that she got pregnant after your big fight, when you almost got divorced. Maybe the stress affected your condition somehow. I'm not a doctor, Elliot. Something in her tone made Elliot wary. She was clearly not telling him everything. You haven't told me the whole truth, Margaret. What else? She paused, then sighed. All right, Elliot. Since we've started this conversation, there was another man. After things didn't work out with Tim, his name won't mean anything to you, just a regular donor from the clinic. Veronica had artificial insemination without your knowledge. But the test didn't work. She didn't get pregnant. And then, literally a month later, she got pregnant by you. Veronica was in shock. She thought you couldn't have children. Elliot shook his head. Another lie, another deception. Why, Margaret? Why complicate things with all these intrigues when you could have just used an anonymous donor from the start? You weren't listening, Elliot, Margaret said irritably. Veronica was afraid you'd take it as a blow to your masculinity. And besides, an anonymous donor means foreign genes, foreign blood. Garrison was your brother. That means the children are Frost's anyway. Elliot stood up and walked over to the window. Behind him was a perfectly manicured garden, every plant in its place, not a single weed. The facade was as flawless as their family life had been. But now, he knew what lay beneath. You have to tell me everything, Margaret, he said without turning around. Every detail, every lie. I deserve to know the truth. And she told him. About how she had arranged Veronica's meetings with Harrison. About how she had forced her daughter to continue the deception even after Olivia was born. How she had manipulated everyone around her to achieve her goal, a big, beautiful family she could be proud of. By the end of her story, Elliot felt devastated. The last few weeks had been like a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. What are you going to do? Margaret asked when he finally got ready to leave. I don't know, Elliot replied honestly. I need to think things through. On the way home, he stopped the car at a lookout point above the city. From here, Rockville looked so peaceful, with its neat houses and green lawns. But now Elliot knew what secrets could be hidden behind those perfect facades. Part of him wanted revenge. He wanted to rush home, tell Veronica everything he thought of her, pack his things and leave forever. He wanted to expose the whole family, show them that they couldn't play with his life with impunity. But another part of him, the part that loved the children more than anything else in the world, couldn't imagine life without them. Without breakfast with Nathan, without awkward conversations with Brandon about school, without the rare but precious moments when Olivia forgot her teenage aloofness and hugged him like she did when they were kids. They were his children, regardless of biology. He changed their diapers, taught them to walk, read them bedtime stories, comforted them after nightmares, and was proud of their successes as if they were his own. Didn't that make them his children more than genetics? But the lie, that long-standing, carefully crafted lie poisoned everything. How could he go on living with a woman who had betrayed him in the most humiliating way possible? How could he look his brother in the eye, knowing that he was the real father of his two children. Elliot sat in his car until nightfall, torn between anger and love, between the desire to destroy and the urge to protect. And the more he thought about it, the clearer the answer became. The anniversary, their 20th anniversary, which they had planned to celebrate in style. The perfect moment to reveal everything. Let everyone know the truth. Howard, Audrey, the children. Let Veronica and Margaret see the consequences of their deception. The decision brought a strange sense of relief. He had 2 weeks to prepare everything. 2 weeks to come up with a plan of action, to decide what to do with his life. Elliot started the engine and drove home. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't a victim of circumstances, but the master of his own destiny. And as painful as it was, the truth was liberating. The truth gave him the strength to move forward, no matter what happened. The banquet hall of the Rockville Country Club was aglow with lights and festive decorations. Margaret had outdone herself in organizing the celebration. Long tables covered with snow-white tablecloths, exquisite tableware, a huge cake with the inscription, 20 years together, and figurines of the bride and groom. The air was filled with the scent of flowers and expensive perfumes. Guests gradually gathered, congratulating Elliot and Veronica. Everyone was there. Veronica's parents, Margaret and Howard, beaming in their roles as happy in-laws. Garrison, unusually tense in his business suit. Veronica's sister Audrey and her husband Tim, keeping a noticeable distance from each other. Colleagues, friends, relatives, and, of course, the children. Olivia in a new evening gown, Brandon in a suit, clearly uncomfortable in his unfamiliar clothes, and Nathan, proud that he had been allowed to stay at the grown-up party. Elliot watched it all as if from the sidelines. For the past 2 weeks he had been living in a fog, automatically playing the role of a happy husband preparing to celebrate an important date. He smiled when he needed to smile, agreed with Veronica and Margaret's suggestions for the party, but inside, a plan was brewing. "Are you okay?" Veronica asked, approaching him with a glass of champagne. "You seem lost in thought today." "Everything's fine," Elliot replied, giving her a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just a little nervous about my speech." "Oh, don't worry," Veronica said, lightly touching his hand. "You're always great at public speaking." She looked stunning in the cream-colored dress she had ordered especially for the evening. Elliot looked at her and tried to remember the last time he had truly felt love for her. Was it before he learned the truth? Or had it faded long before that, gradually, imperceptibly, even to himself? Dinner was pleasant, with small talk and toasts. Garrison kept casting anxious glances at Elliot but kept his distance. Margaret, on the other hand, was in her element, moving from one group of guests to another, enjoying her role as hostess. Finally, it was time for the speech. Margaret tapped her fork delicately against her glass, drawing the guests' attention. "And now, dear friends, I give the floor to the guest of honor, our dear Elliot, who has made my daughter happy for 20 years. Applause rang out. Elliot stood up, feeling the eyes of everyone present on him. His heart was pounding, but his determination only grew stronger with each beat. "Thank you to everyone who came today to share this special evening with us," he began in a calm voice. 20 years is a long time for a marriage. During that time, Veronica and I have been through a lot together, joys and sorrows, victories and defeats. He took a sip of water from the glass standing next to him. "They say that the foundation of a good marriage is honesty and trust. Unfortunately, I have recently learned that our marriage had neither." A surprised whisper swept through the room. Veronica, sitting next to him, froze with a smile on her face. "I've been deceived all these years," Elliot continued, his voice remaining steady, although a hurricane of emotions was raging inside him. "I recently took a DNA test and found out that, of my 3 children, Only Nathan is my biological son." The silence that followed was so absolute that you could hear a pin drop. Veronica turned pale. Margaret clutched her heart, and Garrison looked away, studying the contents of his glass. "Olivia and Brandon," Elliot looked at the children sitting at the next table, "your real father is my brother Garrison. And it wasn't a casual affair. It was a carefully thought-out plan, organized by my mother-in-law Margaret with the consent of my wife Veronica." Olivia let out a strangled sound like a sob. Brandon stared with wide eyes, his face expressing complete disbelief. Nathan, not quite understanding what was happening, looked around anxiously. "Elliot, stop!" Veronica jumped up, her voice trembling. "You don't understand what you're saying." "I understand perfectly well, Veronica," Elliot replied calmly. "I know everything. About how Margaret arranged your meetings with Harrison when we were having trouble conceiving. About how, after Olivia was born, she insisted on repeating the experiment to get a grandson. And about how, after Harrison refused, you tried to recruit Tim, your sister's husband." At these words, Audrey turned sharply to Tim, her face expressing shock and pain. "Tim? Is that true?" Tim, pale as a sheet, nodded. "They asked me. But I couldn't, Audrey, I swear I refused." "Oh God," Audrey whispered, moving away from her husband. Margaret finally came to her senses. "Elliot, this is not the place or the time for such conversations. Think of the children." "They're all I think about, Margaret," Elliot replied. "For the last 20 years I've been living a lie. My children have been raised in a lie. But today, it ends." Veronica approached him, her eyes filling with tears. "Elliot, please, let's talk in private. I can explain everything." "It's too late for explanations." Elliot shook his head. "I know everything, from Garrison, from your mother. I know about the diagnosis, about your plan, about all your attempts." He turned to the guests, many of whom were in shock. "I apologize for ruining your evening, but I felt that we all needed at least one moment of honesty after 20 years of lies." Olivia suddenly rose from her seat and rushed to the exit, sobbing. Brandon followed her after a moment's hesitation. Nathan remained seated at the table, looking confusedly at his parents. "You've ruined everything," Margaret hissed, approaching Elliot. "Are you happy now?" "I didn't destroy our family, Margaret," Elliot replied quietly. "You did that 20 years ago when you decided you had the right to play with my life." Howard, Margaret's husband, who had been silently watching the drama unfold, suddenly stood up. "Did you know about this?" he asked his wife, his voice trembling. "All these years you knew and participated in this deception." Margaret turned to her husband, her confidence wavering for the first time. "Howard, I did it for the family." "For the family?" Howard repeated. "You manipulated our daughter, made her cheat on her husband, dragged his brother into this, and you call that for the family?" He shook his head and headed for the door. "I don't know who you are anymore, Margaret, and I'm not sure I want to know." "Howard!" Margaret rushed after her husband, but he didn't even turn around. Chaos reigned in the hall. Audrey yelled at Tim. Guests whispered among themselves. Some hurried to the exit, feeling uncomfortable in the midst of a family drama. Veronica stood in the middle of the chaos, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you do this? Why, Elliot?" "Because 20 years of lies is too much," he replied. "Because the children deserve to know the truth, and because I deserve the choice that you and Margaret took away from me." Garrison finally approached them. "Ellie, you shouldn't have done this." "Don't call me Ellie," Elliot snapped. "And don't you dare tell me what I should or shouldn't do. You slept with my wife, Garrison, twice, at my mother-in-law's request. What does that make the three of you?" Garrison stepped back, unable to find the words to respond. At that moment, Nathan ran up to Elliot, wrapped his arms around his waist, and burst into tears. "Dad, what's going on? Why is everyone yelling?" Elliot crouched down, hugging his son. I'm sorry, Nathan. Adults sometimes do stupid things, but everything will be okay. I promise. Are you really my dad? The boy asked through his tears. Yes. Elliot hugged his son tighter. I'm your real dad, and I'll always love you, no matter what happens. Veronica tried to find Olivia and Brandon, but they had already left the hall. One of the guests said he saw the teenagers leave in a taxi. See what you've done, Veronica shouted at Elliot. The children are in shock. They've run away and no one knows where they are. They went home, Elliot replied calmly. I already got a message from Olivia. She's fine, as well as she can be in this situation, and she wants to talk to her real father. Garrison shuddered at these words. I don't know what to say to them, Elliot. You'll have to think of something, Elliot said, getting up and holding Nathan's hand. Because now you're officially the father of 2 teenagers, Gary. Congratulations. He headed for the exit, leading Nathan behind him. Where are you going? Veronica called after him. Home, Elliot replied without turning around. I'll pick up my things tomorrow, and we'll discuss what to do next. Custody of Nathan, division of property, divorce, one thing at a time. He left the room, leaving behind a broken family and 20 years of marriage based on lies. The next few days passed in a fog. Elliot temporarily settled in a motel on the outskirts of town. Olivia and Brandon refused to talk to Veronica and hardly left their rooms. Margaret discovered that Howard had withdrawn a large sum of money from their account and left for an unknown destination, leaving only a short note. I need time to think. Audrey filed for divorce, despite Tim's assurances that he had not been unfaithful to her. On Thursday evening, 5 days after the disastrous holiday, Olivia called Elliot. Dad? Her voice sounded uncertain, as if she doubted she had the right to call him that. Hi, sweetheart, Elliot replied, feeling a lump rise in his throat. How are you? I don't know, she replied honestly. Everything's weird. Brandon hardly leaves his room. Mom's trying to talk to us, but I understand, Elliot said gently. You all need time. Uncle Garrison came by today, Olivia continued after a pause. He tried to explain. He said he always cared about us, just from a distance. Elliot didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to protect Olivia from Garrison, but another part understood that he had no right to deprive the children of a relationship with their biological father. How do you feel about this? He finally asked. I don't know, Olivia repeated. It's all so confusing, but you know what? You'll always be my real dad, the one who taught me how to ride a bike and checked my homework, the one who was always there. Always. Elliot felt tears welling up in his eyes. Thank you, sweetheart. That means a lot to me. Autumn in Rockville was exceptionally picturesque. The trees along the streets were painted in shades of gold and crimson, and the air was filled with the freshness and scent of fallen leaves. Elliot loved this time of year, especially now that his life had finally found some stability. 6 months had passed since that memorable evening at the country club, 6 months of a new life. Elliot now lived in a small but cozy house on the other side of town. Joint custody of Nathan was arranged quickly. Neither Veronica nor Elliot wanted to traumatize their son with lengthy court proceedings. Things were more complicated with Olivia and Brandon, but gradually their relationship with Elliot began to improve. On that Sunday morning, Elliot was preparing breakfast, waiting for the children to arrive. Olivia and Brandon had promised to stop by before lunch, and he was supposed to pick up Nathan from Veronica's in the afternoon. The doorbell rang earlier than he expected. Audrey was standing at the door with a bag of fresh pastries. I decided to stop by early, she smiled. I hope I'm not in the way. No, of course not, Elliot stepped aside to let her in. I'm just making coffee. Over the past 3 months, Audrey had become a frequent guest at his house. After her divorce from Tim, she, like Elliot, was trying to build a new life. They were united not only by a shared past, but also by similar experiences of betrayal by loved ones. At first, they just talked, supporting each other. But over time, Elliot found himself looking forward to their meetings with particular anticipation. "How did Brandon do on his algebra exam?" Audrey asked, setting the cups on the table. "He got a B," Elliot replied proudly. "He called yesterday and said he's definitely going to be in the advanced math class now." "He's always been smart, he just didn't believe in himself," Audrey nodded. They sat down at the table, enjoying the simple moment of peace. "Sometimes I can't believe how much things have changed," Elliot said thoughtfully. "But I'm starting to think the changes were for the best. At least now there's no more lies in my life." Audrey covered his hand with hers. "You deserve an honest relationship, Elliot. We all do." At that moment, the doorbell rang again. Olivia and Brandon had arrived. Elliot went to open the door, feeling his heart fill with warmth. Despite all the trials he had endured, he had kept the most important thing: his family. Not the one based solely on blood ties, but a real family built on love, honesty, and mutual respect.